Good afternoon. We have today's podcast Q&A with me, Matt Lazaro. And hopefully we'll have Ryan back on the podcast soon. Just things are actually busy and, Ryan actually works. Not that I don't, but I have more flexibility. So we do have the podcast Q&A stuff. We asked you guys on Instagram what you want to learn about. And some of it I think is some good questions, and some of it I'm wondering what the hell you guys are thinking. But nonetheless, we are going to answer them and likely tag you guys so you will get your answers. Or maybe I'll leave some of these as anonymous because some of these are quite ridiculous. But a few things to cover. Number one, if you enjoy the podcast, make sure that you subscribe and tell all your friends. If you feel like you benefit from any of the knowledge, please share this so we can grow this and grow together. Right, guys? Okay, so let's get started. Number one of the first questions that came through, and it's actually more common of a question than you'd think. It's about sex. Yes. In particular, whether you should have sex before or after a workout. And simply it doesn't really matter. One of the old sayings back in the day that they would tell fighters is not to have sex prior to a fight, primarily because it may make you weaker. There's actually some studies that were done on this, and it's not true. It doesn't really matter. It's possible that it might actually help, but if you are having a lot of this vigorous activity prior to training, you may not be as energetic to train. So before or after, I don't think it matters. If you are having a longer training session ahead of you, maybe just wait till later in the day. So I hope that's helpful. It's probably healthier to just in general get laid anyways, regardless of timing. So take that with a grain of salt. Let's see here. Next question we have, it is, how often should I change supplements? Well, it depends what we're talking about. So not all supplements are the same. In the sense, not all supplements should be taken indefinitely, and there should be times where you're going on certain things and coming off of them. But depending on what you're using, that kind of determines how often you should cycle through things. But things like, let's say, multivitamins and fish oils and the basics, I would say, generally using them all the time is usually a good thing because you're filling in gaps in nutritional deficiencies and little things like that. That's actually going to help, in the long term from a health standpoint. So that's definitely helpful. If you're doing anything that's potentially suppressing a system, like there's the PA7 is a very common product that we like people to use, and people tend to like using it. And, that does tend to work better in cycles. So going through 2 to 3 months at a time and coming on may actually help it work a little better the next go around. But keep in mind, just like in terms of your training should work in cycles and whatnot too. So there may be times to cycle on and off of even something like creatine, which generally I don't think it's something that you really need to cycle on and off of or change. It just depends. But overall, if your goals change, if the circumstances change, then yeah, you should change your supplements. And it really is just kind of contingent on what you actually are using and why you're using it. Prime example, actually, something like vitamin D. I personally take vitamin D in the wintertime, mainly because I'm not getting enough sunlight, and I operate and feel better at a certain level, even with getting as much sunlight as I can during the winter and even fall. But during the summer, when I go get my labs done, I'm getting maybe an hour, maybe longer of sunlight every day. This gives me this nice tan, right? If you can't tone it, tan it, right? But nonetheless, if you measure something and you can, have a justifiable reason to actually change something or not take it, then yeah, that makes sense. If there's specific supplements you want to learn about, guys, just shoot us a message or send us an email, however you want. Contact us, and we'll go over it. Let's see here. Where are we at? Number 3. Oh, here we go. Sorry. This thing wasn't coming up. Yes. So here's one. This is a really, really common thing, and it's about aspartame or any artificial sweetener for that most. And as you can see, I'm drinking a Coke Zero. I don't have a problem with artificial sweeteners, particularly aspartame or sucralose or any of those things. They tend to not be problematic, especially in terms of, let's say, weight loss. Whether they have a negative health impact, I don't know. It's debatable. I think we tend to conflate issues with something that we're trying to demonize per se with little knowledge on what's actually going on. You know, there's some research papers out there that make some very weak correlations. Like if you know anything about statistics, when you're looking at certain statistics, without getting into, I don't know, it gets kind of boring when you start looking at the actual numbers. Nonetheless, certain things need to be over a certain threshold to be statistically valuable within the actual study. Otherwise, if the group of people that's being tested, if there's a statistical anomaly that looks good, it can present itself as a potential factor. But one of the funny things is a lot of times we fail to take the rest of that into consideration when we use a larger portion of the population. Then it becomes statistically irrelevant, basically, which is more common than not. And this is the case, especially with things like aspartame. But one of the common things that's said is that, hey, Diet Coke or any diet product for that most is allegedly worse than drinking actual soda, which is completely absurd. There's no way that you're going to tell me that drinking something that has no caloric value becomes more problematic than something that has an actual caloric value. And even furthermore, that's derived of high fructose corn syrup, which we know, has to process differently in the sense of the liver has to metabolize it for it to become usable, meaning it needs to break it down into glucose because it's in the form of fructose that's harder, that's not usable until the liver does its job. So, and then if anything, we have more evidence that points towards things like high fructose corn syrup being detrimental towards metabolism, health, and overall health for overall health in general. So, it's like from what I've read in the literature, the only way you're going to run into a legitimate issue with drinking diet soda is if you had the equivalent of consuming 60 to 80 pounds of it. And then this is the difference in terms of when they're doing tests on actual, let's say, lab rats. The amount of what they can give to these lab rats is astronomical relative to what we actually consume a day, which would be fractional at best. And it's really also contingent on your size, on how much you weigh, and then you can metabolize a certain amount of it. So, in a certain time frame per se. So overall, guys, the thing is look, if you're not comfortable using it, don't. But don't get the idea that other sweeteners would technically be safer, because something like stevia, which I'm a fan of, stevia is technically a herb. Stevia has an actual amount that we can legitimately know that it becomes toxic, right? It has an actual toxicity rate that we can measure, right? And it's much lower than aspartame and even sucralose. Because you're able to actually metabolize it overall. Whereas like something like sucralose, which is Splenda, that's what you get in like what's those things, Crystal Light and stuff like that. And the vast majority of, let's say, protein powders are actually use Splenda mostly as a sweetener. But the fact is something like Splenda, your body doesn't absorb it. It just gets rid of it. Whereas stevia sense, well, it tends to be better, but or people say it tends to be better without any actual evidence to prove that. But interestingly, stevia does have some evidence that it may actually help improve insulin sensitivity. But the funny thing is, even with across across the board, when people consume diet products, right, products that are artificially sweetened that have no caloric value, they tend to lower glucose, right? Because you cannot increase, and there's a reason for that, and I'll get to that in a minute. But there's no way that you're going to consume something that has practically no calories to become calories stored on your body. You see how that doesn't make any sense? So if drinking some diet soda from time to time helps you stay better adherent to your diet or your calories that you're shooting for, or just making these changes to stop consuming shitty food, then by all means use it. Trust me, it's fine. But if you feel weird or you don't like the way it makes your stomach feel, then don't use it. It's not a big deal, guys. All right? So hopefully that's all settled. If there's more questions about artificial sweeteners, send them in. Let's see here. Oh, let me check. I may have some more questions that just came in. So here's a good question. It says, I feel stronger in the afternoons. It says, so the question is, would I burn more fat if I trained in the morning or in the afternoon? So this is a really good question, because see, here's the thing. In theory, energy, in a sense of how much energy you're using or how much energy you're burning, technically you'll burn more calories when you're able to perform better. So meaning, let's say in a CrossFit workout, in theory, if the duration is the same, but your heart rate is able to stay elevated for that time period, you're going to burn more calories. And being that it's a higher intensity, the ratio of carbohydrates and fats tend to be blended, which is good. And then even the benefit that you receive after the fact of additional calories being used from recovering and repairing and muscle damage that's occurring and all these other metabolic stimuli. There's additional things that go on there. But the thing that we have to consider is how consistent are we, number one, with our calories or just our total diet, especially if weight loss is the goal. So if that's not consistent, and let's say you send it in the morning or you send it in the evening or afternoon, but you feel like complete dog shit for the rest of the day and you don't move that much, then we're going to have an issue, right? You're going to spend less energy in total, primarily because there's not enough consistency of how many calories that your body is consistently expending on a regular basis. So, and this is where I personally known this, not known, but I personally experienced this, that if the intensity of my workouts is too high for too long, then naturally everything in my body is going to try to downregulate to conserve energy for the latter portion of the day. And then one of the other issues that you may run into if you train too late is that your nervous system may be too excited to where it's hard to go to sleep, and now you screwed up your sleep cycle. And in turn, we know when you actually have poor sleep, you tend to burn less calories the next day. And a lot of that's because the body's constantly trying to regulate energy and do things to keep things stable, right? Meaning it wants to continuously have stay in this nice stable range of not going up and not going down. And this is where actually a good lead into one of the last questions, which has to do with why does it, here, let me read this. Why does it feel like no matter what I do, I cannot lose weight? By the way, it says, I've been trying to lose the same 50 pounds for like the last year. Note, this individual that sent this in, I know them, and they've actually lost a significant amount of weight already, roughly 70 pounds, but there's another 50 pounds that they want to lose, right? So they're roughly, at one point, over 100 pounds overweight. And so from a body fat standpoint, this means they're probably, when they started, were in the high 50 percentile range of body fat. So more than 50% of their, so they were definitely classified as what we would consider obese. Okay. So we're only using these terms so I can give you guys some definitive explanations of why this is important, giving you some context. Okay. So if you spent a significant time being overweight or obese, or what we consider clinically obese, which has to reach a certain BMI. But overall, I would say if you have signs of metabolic syndrome, which are your waist circumference exceeds 35 for a woman, exceeds 40 for a man, if you have poor cholesterol, poor triglycerides, dysregulation in sugar levels, if you have any of those things, essentially my answer in the sense of why weight loss becomes hard is because when you maintain a certain weight for a certain time frame, there are certain adaptations that the body undergoes to maintain that weight, right? So one of the things that there's a lot of new research on in terms of weight loss, specific to obesity, and why it's so hard to continuously lose weight over time. And there's some theories in the sense of what it may be related to. And one of it is a hormone that's regulated by our hypothalamus, which your hypothalamus controls a ton of stuff, guys. If you know anything about basic physio, your hypothalamus controls a lot of important things that keep you stable. It's about stabilizing things. And one of the hormones that gets affected the most in terms of obesity is something called leptin, right? And leptin, if you've probably heard about it, leptin basically is, it regulates appetite, but it also regulates like how much fat that it wants on your body. And so the amount of fat that you have will determine how much leptin that you actually have in your body and how much is released. So if you become leptin resistant, meaning the response that you get when you consume food at a certain amount that allows you to keep your fat storages at a certain set point, becomes indefinitely harder because the body's not turning off that switch that allows you to manage appetite better. So when the leptin is dysregulated, it does all sorts of crazy shit in a sense from your hypothalamus. In the sense it can affect your overall energy expenditure. So generally, when you feel like you are doing everything possible to lose weight, generally one thing that we always notice is that statistically speaking, most people burn far fewer calories than they think they do. So if they think they're burning like 3,000 calories or so, on average, we can slash that in half, if not less. And that's really where they land. Because likewise, same thing with calories consumed, the effects on the behavior that relate to eating habits can affect the actual consumption of calories so far much that you can easily overconsume, let's just say by 50 to 80%. That's the vast majority of what we see. So most people underestimate how much they actually consume, especially if they're not tracking. You don't know. We were just going on how we feel, but most people underestimate how much they consume by anywhere from 50 to 80%, and we overestimate how much we move by 50 to 80%. So you have the hypothalamus and this leptin response, and it's like the governor to regulate how much energy you spend and how much energy it wants you to intake. And when that is dysregulated, it becomes indefinitely harder to make longer term progress. And this is why weight becomes really easy to regain. And then it becomes easy to maintain certain weight, right? So it's almost like a lot of people that come in to see me, they say, hey, I've been stuck at this weight for this long. And they've been dieting on and off for the last decade, and they've not been able to get past this sticking point, but they were bigger at one point, but their body's really, really liking the weight that they're at, but they don't like where they're at. So this is where it becomes a little more complicated in how to approach, how to regulate their calories in, calories out. It is weight loss and always will always be about calories in, calories out. It is but the complicated part is knowing how we can become more accurate and precise about how to track these things without developing an eating disorder. Because that's the thing, we always joke around like when some people become obsessed about, I need to see my abs. And the funny thing is, people with abs generally are just good at starving, right? And this is where like me personally, I don't like to stay really lean because it forces me, it forces much more restrictions on how much food I can consume. And even my body's regulation of where it likes to be and where it feels healthiest is at a certain percentage of body fat, because it's able to regulate these hormones that affect behavior, right? And eating habits and how much energy you feel or don't feel. So I hope that makes sense, because essentially when things are dysregulated and you're not healthy, your body basically will do everything possible to defend against weight loss, especially if you spent a lot of time being overweight. And I would say, like, if you're looking to lose 70 to 100 pounds and you've been that way for more than a decade, I would say that that's quite a while. But if you need help, we know what we're doing here, so we can show you the process. And here's one thing that you have to remember, especially when going into legitimately trying to make these physical changes. You have to make sure that you're not married to the scale, that you're not obsessed with exclusively the scale, because you have to figure out ways to make sure that all the other things that relate to the scale are falling into place. Because if they're not, nothing ever changes. And if you're not giving yourself any wins that are unrelated to the scale, you're always going to end up back just going through these crazy cycles of binging and getting strict and getting, saying F it, having fuck it syndrome. And it's not a good place to be. It feels like, one step forward, two steps back type of thing. And the idea is to avoid that. All right. So let's see if there's anything else on here. There are some questions. Actually, this might be a good question. So someone asked a question about certain drugs, but I'm not going to give advice on those at all. But one thing is someone's asking about the carnivore diet, and if you're not sure what the carnivore diet is, it's essentially the complete opposite of a plant-based diet. That's right. So it's basically no plants, all animal product, right? And there's different levels of it. Essentially, what I've been figuring out. Some people just eat meat. Some people eat meat and organ meat. Some people eat meat and organ meat and honey and fruit. And so it's funny is there's just varying degrees of this diet. But the interesting thing that's very, very consistent is that, and I've noticed this in the past because I've done elimination diets for my clients over the years, and starting even as long as 15 years ago, I've done and put people on these elimination diets that seem very similar to this, primarily because the one consistent thing I've seen is that when people do suffer from some severe autoimmune issues, especially if it's related to gut and skin, when you eliminate a lot of grains and vegetables and sugar, essentially, there's a steep decrease in inflammation in total. Now, see, it's not to say that vegetables and grains are the problem. It's that their current status of how inflamed they are is not being helped by any of these foods. It may be exacerbated because there's current circumstances of their current health may make them respond poorly to these foods, right? And so one of the issues that you run into is we want to demonize certain foods when in turn what we should be doing is to see and eat more of the foods that we know that make us feel better, right? And so if we feel better eating certain foods, we should focus on eating those foods. And this is where when I take someone through what I would call an elimination diet, when we go through that process and we are allowed to focus on how does it actually make me feel? How's my stomach feel? How's my energy feel? How am I sleeping? And like, does it even taste good? And it's like, of course, pizza will always taste good. Chips will always taste good. And candy will probably always taste good. And we all have our preferences on varying degrees. But at the end of the day, if you are able to focus on eating the foods that make you feel good more consistently, it's easier to manage, and it's easier to manage with less yo-yos overall. So I hope that makes sense, guys. I'm not going to dive into it too much more. Obviously, we can get into it more if there's more questions. Send in your questions, like I said, and if you benefit and like any of the content, please subscribe. Follow us on your favorite social media platform. Well, basically, we're just on Instagram and Facebook. So if you're not on there,